So we tread on them, we zap them, and all too often we see them as the target for our next can of fly spray. But I believe that the face you see here is not the face of a problem. This is the face of a very real solution to a very big issue. So what is that issue? Well, to understand that, we need to go to the heart of the problem first. And the heart of that problem is a growing population of people with a growing appetite for meat. So basically, the global population at the moment is rising. It's bigger than it ever has been before in terms of humans. And also this blue line here is the total meat consumption. So you can see that meat consumption per person is going up as well as the global population of people as a whole. And that gives you this exponential graph here, which is the total meat consumption by the planet as a whole. And the fact that you get more people eating more meat means that you get the first one, or the one increase from 100 million tonnes of meat to 200 million tonnes of meat, taking 25 years, but to get from 200 to 300 million tonnes of meat, we're increasing, per year this is, where it's taking only 7 years. And that is an alarming increase. It's alarming because of these figures. So we see that in 2050, we're going to be living on a planet which requires 75% more meat. And that's a problem because we're going to also see 52% of the world's population living in a place of water stress and 70% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, if we make our 2 degrees warming targets, are going to be coming from agriculture. So why is that? Well, in terms of the emissions, meat produces a phenomenal amount of emissions per kilogram. These dots here are to scale, so you can see that beef's emissions dwarf those of pork and poultry, which in turn dwarf those of crickets, which come in at about 0.25% of the emissions per kilogram, so for the same amount of output of meat of those of pork and poultry. And just for a little bit of context, if you want to produce these same emissions using a vehicle, the average petrol car, you need to drive about 14 kilometres to produce the same emissions as beef. You need to provide a kilogram of beef, you need to drive about 3 kilometres to produce the same amount of emissions as pork and poultry, and to produce the same amount of emissions as a kilogram of crickets, you need to drive a grand total of about 7.5 metres. So that's a fairly substantial decrease. But in terms of land, there's also a massive issue, because on a planet where we're getting more and more people that we need to house somewhere, in particular, it's becoming increasingly extravagant to use over 100 square metres of land to produce just 1 kilogram of meat. And that's exactly what is occurring at the moment. It's a trend that is seen in an area the size of the South Island of New Zealand deforested every 10 years in Africa for agriculture alone, and that's seriously concerning when you consider the abundance of life that those forests support and also the value that those forests have in terms of carbon reuptake. Locusts and crickets, on the other hand, come in at under 50 metres squared per kilogram of output, which is again a phenomenal decrease, and I would say that's even a very conservative estimate for insects. There are some indications that a facility of around 160 square metres is actually capable of producing about 4 tonnes of insects per year. Now, there is absolutely no way, no matter how efficient your farming is, that you can produce 4 tonnes of beef or pork or poultry inside a 160 square metre facility, certainly not with humane farming practices. And what about water? Well, water is another key issue. It's another battleground on this future of food. 70% of our fresh water is already used by farming today throughout the world. 70% of available fresh water. So that means that when we're looking at a world where we have to increase the meat consumption by around 75%, we have to be asking serious questions about whether we're going to be able to do that on a planet which is already using 70% of water to produce a fraction of that amount of meat. But insects again come out on top. They require about 50% less, or 100%, so they are twice as efficient, rather, at converting water into meat, and that means that you're saving about 400 to 850 litres per kilogram of meat produced, which for those 9.7 billion people living in water-scarce regions is really quite a massive plus. So how are they able to do it? Well, the key is feed conversion ratios. Essentially, you can eat the entirety of an insect, like a cricket or a locust. That 20% that's missing from up here is basically fibre, which is primarily chitin. which is an important ingredient in the human diet, even if it's not actively digested in and of itself. And furthermore, crickets are not warm-blooded, which means they're not wasting energy regulating their body temperature, so they don't have to eat as much to take in that energy to do so. So basically, it comes down to two key points. The first is they're not warm-blooded, so they're not regulating their body temperature, and the second is they're not producing inedible structures, like bones, for instance, which we can't actually eat. So you're getting a lot more meat out for the feed that you're putting in to these insects than you do for traditional livestock. But it doesn't have to cost us either. So these bugs will actually come out more efficient even than synthetic or lab-grown meats. But they're also going to be better than that alternative when you're looking at the nutritional outputs for humans as well. Insects can beat calcium, spinach, and beef at their own nutritional games. They'll also have more potassium than a banana does, or than bananas do, the same weight of bananas. They've got more omega-3 and B vitamins than fish. They really are a nutritional superpower, or superfood, rather. But why New Zealand? Well, this is a key reason. This really shocked me when I was doing this research. The HALF Index stands for Human Acquisition of Land for Food. And basically, it's a measure of the percentage of the Earth's habitable land surface which would be required under current farming efficiency levels to provide the entire planet with the diet that each of these countries here, which is the top three, the bottom three, and the average, eats every year. So for New Zealand, you would get a literally impossible figure of 191.2% of the habitable land surface tied up in agriculture in order to feed the planet on the diet that New Zealanders eat every year. So to put that more simply, you'd need 2 planet Earths, and then you'd need to use the entirety of the habitable land of those 2 Earths, but you'd have an area the size of Thailand left over to house the entire world's 18 billion odd population, which is really quite a frightening, this is if you're going by 2050 rather, which is really quite a frightening figure. And so New Zealand is not leading the charge in the right direction in terms of our diet. So I believe we have a responsibility in some sense to at least start promoting a better way of agriculture. And this is one of the things getting in the way. It's a tweet in response to the Impossible Burger saga, which for those of you that missed it was basically where Air New Zealand said, we're going to put synthetic meat patties or lab-grown meat patties on planes as an alternative to New Zealand's beef patties. But for some reason, New Zealand seemed to be so insecure about having an alternative to those meat patties that we had this sort of response from one of our MPs. This is a concern, and it should be a concern, particularly when you're talking about pushing New Zealand's food products. In my view, if you have to push a product to consumers, then consumers are not valuing it enough in comparison to other products. So what I believe New Zealand needs to be doing is looking at actually competing with these alternatives, providing alternatives, and actually getting into the mix. If consumers are valuing alternatives like lab-grown meats, then we should be looking at those alternatives and investing in research so that we can keep up with the trends in a changing world. The other question that people often have is, well, what about the taste? And most people assume that because they haven't tasted locusts or even really heard of people eating locusts or crickets, that they must not taste very good. But the humble story, or the not very humble story of the lobster here in the US is a good example of why that is not the case. Lobsters are today obviously a delicacy. They're a very expensive food item for the rich and famous to enjoy on a night out, but it wasn't always that way. In the US in the 1800s, one of their politicians wrote that lobster shells about the house are looked down upon as a sign of poverty and degradation, something that you would never hear today. Because if you've got lobsters and shells in your house, you're obviously eating pretty well, right? But back in the day, in fact, even as late as 1940, cans of lobster went for 1/5 of the price of a can of baked beans. These really were not prized food items, and they still tasted the same. But the reason that they came into their own was because the train system started providing them to guests from the inlands of America, the inner, non-coastal regions essentially. And on those train trips, the people that were eating the lobsters basically didn't know what it was. They didn't know they were meant to look down on it, so they ate it and they thought it tasted great. And I think that really illustrates just how important social perception is in determining how much flavour there is in something like eating insects. But this is another big barrier. So at the moment in New Zealand, you're looking at a cost of about $150 per kilogram of locusts or cricket flour on a good day. And that's just simply too high. But it doesn't need to be that way. The farms in Thailand, on our indications, basically can produce this flour at about $2 per kilogram. But the trouble is you're getting all these different stages adding on value, and then when it gets to New Zealand, the businesses that are selling it on have to slap on their markup as well to compensate for the risk, essentially, that people won't buy into it. And so if we were to produce it in New Zealand, we could produce it much cheaper, we could lower that barrier to entry for consumers, and we could actually see it start to take off as it really should. And it doesn't have to cost New Zealand either. The global insect industry, edible insect industry, is forecast to be worth $1 billion in 2024. That's a massive industry that we can be taking a slice of, and it's not just in the least developed countries. In America, these pale blue bars here demonstrate that you're seeing a 400% increase in the value of crickets and locusts as edible insects between 2017 and 2024, and that is truly massive, something we should be capitalising on. So to conclude then, it's time we started thinking about the elephant in the room, or the cow in the room, or the sheep in the room, because the trouble is that when often we talk about a big problem, we're talking about someone carrying the world on their shoulders. But I hope that after today, at least, if not before, you recognise that this is the wrong way around. For the world is carrying us on its shoulders, and right now it is tiring. It doesn't need to be tiring. New Zealand has always led the way in agriculture. We see ourselves as a clean, green country, and we should be leading this charge in the direction of a more sustainable planet, so that this planet, this pale blue dot, can remain as pure as New Zealand should be for many years to come. Thank you.
So what do crickets taste like?
They actually taste really good. They're quite nutty, and you can mix them, you can grind them into a powder, so you basically roast them or dry them, and then that powder can be used in baking, it can be used in smoothies. One thing I'd really like to see advanced at the moment is the use of it in patties, so that it really can be an alternative to meat. But yeah, it tastes really good. We actually did a taste test at our flat a while ago with a substantial quantity of cricket flour in a smoothie, and so we had 6 people, and 2 of them managed to pick the one with the smoothie, with the crickets in it, rather.
All right.
Yeah.
So it's a protein powder rather than a nice steak on your plate.
Well, you can eat it whole. So you can eat them whole, you can eat them in a powder, which can be put into baking or things like that. I think that an area which really needs further work is looking at making it into a substitute for something like a steak, because there's no reason that powder can't be mixed into a patty or made into a steak substitute. As I say, it's more efficient than a synthetically cultured meat is in terms of energy inputs and environmental efficiency. So really what we should be using is using that raw ingredient to make something that can compete with steaks.
In your exponential increase in meat graph, meat demand and meat consumption, did you factor in an apparent increase in vegetarianism or veganism?
Yep, so those graphs basically just show, so one shows the increase in population, the other one just takes the average the consumption by an average person. So it uses, I think it's the UN's data on national, and then they extrapolate it out to international consumption. So it does include vegetarianism.
And how would you farm crickets?
So you can farm them in boxes. So they're much more, you can more densely farm them, obviously, than traditional livestock. They need heating in New Zealand. They want to be at about 28 degrees. So that's one of the major costs. But essentially, I mean, I had them growing in my wardrobe for some time. They're not very difficult to farm.
Just for late night snacks, you mean?
Well, yeah, we were doing some experiments. Yeah.
And you would feed them what?
Well, that's the good thing with crickets is they do eat a lot. They don't eat large quantities, but they'll eat a lot of different things. So we actually, the most innovative we got was feeding them nori, like the Japanese seaweed. But they actually eat meat. There's no reason you'd feed them meat because that'd be silly.
That would be silly.
Yeah, they eat chicken feed, they'll eat veggie scraps. So that really the potential for feeding for their feed is there's a big scope.
But you wouldn't need pasture land to grow grass to feed to the crickets?
No, I mean, you can use waste food basically, or even if you are using pasture land, it would actually still be more efficient because those feed conversion ratios are so much more efficient than the likes of traditional livestock. You'd still be needing less grass or less hay or whatever it is you choose to feed them.
Thank you.